But you see, the point was
Yeah.
that people knew if they wanted to see the governor,
Yeah.
they could.
Yes.
It was the same sort of thing we set up in the campaign. We had him campaigning block by block.
Right.
He would crisscross across the block. And so people would say, you know, you never would know when George Romney might show up at your door. And then we made commercials about that, TV commercials. You never can expect when, you know, the governor may be at the door. And for many, he did a lot of door-to-door campaigning. But the whole idea was openness,
Right.
which was also the case in the convention. I felt, because of my experience in the legislature, that it was nearly not open enough. So we televised. All of the convention proceedings were televised. All the meetings were open. That was a way, I guess, of my saying, you know, the legislature really ought to open up more. But the governor, Romney, really agreed and pushed that as well.
Let me ask you one more question about that 1965-66 legislature controlled by the Democrats by huge margins. They passed a lot of legislation that had been pent up in their souls for years, and they were out of power. It hadn't controlled the legislature at all. A lot of it labor and union oriented type legislation, stuff like what might be called prevailing wage, which was a controversial issue where public institutions have to pay contractors the prevailing wage negotiated through collective bargaining for building projects rather than maybe the lowest bidder. And that, by the way, has now been repealed in Michigan. But George Romney signed that bill. He signed, you know, prevailing wage legislation and some other heavily union, heavily Democratic legislation. I know that George Romney was famous for trying to crash union picnics and climbing over fences. He wanted to appeal to the working man. Do you think, again, this was his attempt to show, you know, I can work with anybody, I can work with these majority Democrats and these unions, and I can show them I'm not going to be some hidebound, negative, you know, opponent and veto stuff and make them try and override my veto. I'm not going to do that. What do you think about that?
That's exactly what he said. Now, the theory, the argument within the staff was a veto is a defeat. If you have to defeat something, that means you couldn't work with the legislature to pass it. So we always took the position that let's work it out with the legislature, let's get what we can, but let's not veto as much as we can. And I think that was the philosophy behind his signing some of that legislation.
Let's backtrack a little bit. Let's go back to 1962. Let's go back to the campaign he ran against John Swainson, okay? He debated John Swainson.
And lost.
Well, I'm going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
How many debates did he have? What happened? Were you there?
Yeah, of course. There were 3 debates. We lost 2 of them because we assumed that Romney would just overpower John Swainson, the governor. It was wrong. He didn't. Swainson ran all over him for 2 debates. The 3rd debate, I think, we won. But by this time, Romney knew what he was doing. But, you know, to go into a debate situation and just assume that you have a high-powered guy like Romney against John Swainson, we just made a bad tactical error.
Well, you say we, but I mean, obviously Romney himself must have been pretty overconfident. He thought he could just steamroll Swainson.
He came out and he said, Walt, the best thing about this debate is it's over.
Kind of tells you right there. Well, what was it like on campaign night, general election night? I think it was the Statler Hotel in Detroit, I'm not sure, when you found that Romney, in fact, did win. I think he won by about 80,000 votes statewide. It was, you know, decisive, but it certainly wasn't a rout. What was the feeling there? And what was the feeling of those of you who knew, okay, we're going to have to go do something now in Lansing?
Well, we'd set up a system that we called weather vane precincts. These are precincts around the state who always went at the way the statewide results were.
Okay.
So we were polling in those states and getting election results from them. So we knew pretty well that we were going to win, or we thought we were going to win. We used that system throughout 3 different elections, although it was hard to believe that we had won that election. And then I guess the next day or 2 days later, Bob Danoff and I think Bill Seaman and I drove to Lansing. And we got out of the car and stood in front of the state capitol and said, okay, now we got it. What the hell do we do with it?
Well, you didn't have much time left before you had to really hit the ground running and make up your mind. But look, you mentioned the weather vane precincts. Wasn't this really the beginning, and you already put it in place to a certain extent, of the ticket splitter philosophy, which became a book that you
Yes.
co-authored with another political science named V. Lance Terrence, right? And published a few years later. But you actually used that, you put it into effect in 1962 for the first time, right?
Well, the conventional wisdom at that time was, if you tell me that you're an independent,
Yes.
that means you vote independent. Well, what does that mean? We figured out that a lot of people who call themselves independent aren't really independent at all. They vote straight Republican or straight Democratic. The only way I know if you are truly independent is if you split your ticket between the candidates of the 2 parties. Then I know that you're exercising independence. So instead of using the old traditional, what you thought of yourself, we used, how do you behave? And then we polled those people and found a lot of Democrats who would split off occasionally for Republicans. So we concentrated on people who would make the split. And that's the way we won in 62. And of course in 64 with Goldwater on the ticket, that was the key to that victory.
Yeah, explain a little bit more about that, because Barry Goldwater was very conservative, at least he was thought to be at the time. You went to the National Convention, did you?
Oh, yeah.
With George Romney in San Francisco's Cow Palace, I believe, where Nelson Rockefeller was shouted down by the delegates.
I'll never forget it.
Yeah, and you knew that if Goldwater's the nominee, he's going to be running for president in Michigan while your boss, George Romney, is running for re-election as governor. Were you thinking at that time, we are doomed?
Yes.
You really thought it was that bad?
It was that bad. Matter of fact, the polling showed us that it was that bad. And the only way we could win was to get people to split their tickets, because they're going to vote for Johnson, which they did, and then get them to vote for Romney. But it was far deeper than that with Romney and Goldwater. It was a civil rights matter. And if you think that people are concerned about Trump today in the Republican Party, you should think back to 1964 and Goldwater. Well, the result was a crushing defeat for Goldwater, which after that, Romney and Eisenhower and Rockefeller and Scranton and others put together what was called the Republican Coordinating Committee to put the Republican Party back together, which they did. And in 1966, you could see the results of that with the Republican victories all over the country, and especially in Michigan.
You mentioned Eisenhower, and that reminds me, I forgot to ask you earlier when we were talking about the Constitutional Convention, didn't Eisenhower come and address the Constitutional Convention
Sure.
in Lansing?
He came on one of the first days of the convention, and his message was, don't try to amend this Constitution with a whole lot of amendments. He says, write a new Constitution and let people vote on the entire Constitution, and I think that changed the attitude and the opinion of many of the Republican delegates, because that's what eventually we did. And it was at that time I met for the first time my longtime friend David Broder of the Washington Post, who came to cover Romney because they thought he might be a presidential candidate,
right,
as well as a gubernatorial candidate.
Well, the argument was the 1908 Constitution, the old Constitution, the one you were meeting on, some of these delegates simply wanted to tack on amendments to it. And Eisenhower basically said, no, just forget about it. Write a new Constitution. And you're saying his argument really kind of carried the day.
Oh, yes, no doubt about it.
Okay. So we get to 1964, you put the ticket splitter philosophy, weather vane precincts into effect. You try to resist what's happening at the top of the ticket to Barry Goldwater in Michigan, who I think lost to Lyndon Johnson by over 1 million votes. And you were successful, and the governor prevailed. He was reelected against Neil Stabler, who had been a former Democratic state chairman, and he was a congressman at large, so he'd been elected statewide in Michigan, right?
That's right.
And did they debate at all? Was there anything like that in '64?
You know, I don't really remember.
You know, I don't remember.
I don't think that they did.
I don't think they did either, and that's kind of weird.
Yeah.
You would have thought that would have happened. I'm not sure Stabler would have been a great debater from everything I knew about him, but I'm a little surprised that didn't happen.